I'm just really glad to be invited to this conversation because it's something that has interested me for 25 years now, at least, probably longer. But I've tried to give language to it and learned about the trappings of language on the way. So yeah, we're looking forward to this, and started as a biologist, did a degree in holistic science, did a PhD in design for human and planetary health, and wrote a book in 2016 called Designing Regenerative Cultures. And that's about the potted history. Is that good?
Okay, thank you so much for that. So we're going to do this in a couple of episodes, and the first episode is around the topic of new ways of seeing, living, and being together. And I've got the honor to ask the first question there, which is, I will give it a short introduction, that question. It's about your moment of knowing, and I will explain a little bit what we mean with that. You know, was that moment of knowing a sudden event or a gradual process? I think you know where it comes from, right? You conclude your book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, with an excerpt from Hieroglyphic Stairway, which is a poem by Drew Dellinger. And the excerpt is titled, "What Did You Do Once You Knew?" And the poem ends with, "Surely you did something." Well, we can all see your ongoing great work, Daniel. But how did this journey start for you, actually? What was your moment of knowing? Was it already present in little Daniel going to school? Has it been triggered by specific events? Can you take us with you in how this evolved for you?
Well, these new ways of seeing we're trying to speak about are at the very same time ancient ways of being that are being rediscovered. We're only speaking about something in new language from a perspective of a culture that has lived separation to the point of believing it, and has created technologies that, as Arthur C. Clarke, I think, said, are indistinguishable from magic. And so on that journey personally, I think now that I'm a father of a 5-year-old, I'm being reminded that the knowing is there from the start, but it's undifferentiated. It's simply participatory, and that is a very different way of being in the world than once we even start with the powerful technology of being taught words, and with that, categories of the world. And I think I quite early on felt a little bit ill at ease with my culture, coming from Germany, understanding like in the decades that I grew up, education about the German history was like re-education of a people to a point that it was like really sticking young faces into a past that wasn't really theirs, but of course in a kind of intergenerational trauma and responsibility was theirs. And so I think that made me reflect quite early on, and also the luck that a sports teacher realized that I wasn't that good in all the kind of competitive ball-based games, and invited me into yoga when I was 11 as an alternative at the school that I was going to. And that very early on introduced me to the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita and just some writing that made me question perspective. Along with living in Munich means in the middle of the Cold War, means understanding that we had cruise missiles and SS-20 pointing at us, and that we were part of the battlefield of World War III at that point in where we were talking about crisis. For some of us, we remember that. For others, it's in history books. But it was imminent. It was real. It was. I remember sitting with my 3.5-year older brother on the roof of our house, looking towards, which was maybe 2 kilometers away, which was the kind of government communications headquarters in Großes-Lohe in Munich. So we knew that one of the direct targets that were being targeted in this game of mutual assured destruction was 2 miles away from us. And so I'm getting all emotional remembering that. But yeah, we've been a threat to ourselves and to life on Earth for a long time. But where we started with the ancient ancestry of us, we need to remember that we wouldn't be here if we hadn't been regenerative, place-sourced cultures, cultures that understood themselves as guardians and expressions of the bioregions they inhabited. That's a different way of being in the world that is in its very nature holistic. And in many ways, our conversation about holism is in the power and the misunderstandings that language can produce. We eventually needed a way back to an understanding that before all that talk, we already had. And for me, that's what holism is trying to do. It's trying to remind us that this is a deeply participatory universe. So yeah, now I've come off topic from my story. Where did it start? And it's a double question, just briefly. It's like knowing how we know, and how that in and of itself is already part of the root causes of the crisis we're currently experiencing. And then knowing the crisis, like knowing how deep the messed up things have gotten at this point, and how 20 past 1, not 5 to 12, it actually is. That's another knowing that is still growing, deepening every day, and maturing me every day beyond taking permanence too serious.
Yes, we will come to the topic of hope or despair in one of the next episodes. And I see Marcus' hand raised. So Marcus, can I ask you to bring in whatever you want to say?
Yes, I wanted to acknowledge that you just helped me understand something about myself, Daniel, that I had not quite so consciously reflected upon, although I was very aware of the theme, and that is, I too grew up in Germany. I grew up near Dortmund and then lived in Heidelberg for a while as well before I moved to the UK in 2003. But this theme of the very conscious education into the past and the intergenerational split. My father, born just after the war, not getting any answers from his family, and the pressure that was on the education system in order to confront the next generation with the sins of the fathers was extraordinary, and a very fertile ground for my own development. So I appreciate the reflections you've given of it, and you've touched on a theme with that. Like you, I also recognize that others had a hand in my development early on. My recognition was not a PE teacher who allowed me to experience yoga, but I had an individual who gave me books. He recognized something and he gave me books of a particular thing that were well beyond my reading age. And it started something, a reflective process. And I'm very aware that in this kind of thing, there is despite our world of separation, for me, a theme of connectedness was set up through this recognition of elders who somehow didn't see themselves as elders, but they they did a service unto me that was very much that, by giving me books that helped me become who I am today. It took me a long time to see it like that. Then you spoke about how these ways of seeing today are really ways of being of an ancient kind. And there is an aspect here with a very fine edge that I have a need to explore. I just wondered what your contribution to that might be, which is that it's very easy to dismiss Western culture and its approach to science and so forth as the reason for the difficulties we experience globally now, the meta crisis, which we will come to later, especially its notion of progress. Any problem will always be sorted in the future. But through a writer called Peter Kingsley, you might be familiar with him. Yes, I discovered for myself that the problem of the West might lie much further back than we so readily assume. He puts his finger very firmly on Plato as the beginning of a disconnection, in Ian McGilchrist's words, sort of a focus on the left brain, advanced very much by Aristotle then, where we were cut off from our mystical past, where Plato did an enormous deed of essentially moving all our right brain, religious, interconnected experience of life. He moved it into, very skillfully rewrote history, as it were, didn't acknowledge his sources, created sources in order to place himself very favorably in a particular light, and that has lived since then in a way that we believed him, but we didn't see the damage he actually did. And so when Whitehead says all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, that is for me the origin it's something that I've explored deeply, and I've been trying to look beyond Plato into the past in order to understand what might the mission of the West actually be. And could it be that this issue with Plato is actually part of what we need to redeem? This is a big interconnected rabbit warren. But I just wanted to offer that into this space, and we can skip it.
No. Let's stay there briefly, because with mentioning Whitehead, I mean, why would Whitehead say this? Because Whitehead was pointing towards process philosophy in one way of speaking. It's just, as you were sharing how important books have been in your life, of course, as you know, from, if you're familiar with my work, the same in my life, and I remember many mentors, who particularly Seton Baxter, who I did my PhD with, who were just genius in feeding me the right book at the right time in a way that just magically allowed me come up with new ideas that I would then excitedly tell him, and then after telling him in the evening, realizing, wait a minute, he planted the seeds. He like I only had that insight because of that conversation that I had with him 2 weeks ago. So I hear all that, but at the same time, I had this interesting email today from somebody who led the subject, so I would look at it with literate people learn words, illiterate people learn worlds. Boom. Boom. That's big. And like to the point, to what we were going to talk about. So nothing is a coincidence. So this person writes to me today. And that addresses Plato's need to objectify the world in order to frame it in ways that can create structures of power over rather than power with, structures of separation rather than structures of interbeing in Thich Nhat Hanh's framing. And more than that, the word is the beginning of like this kind of work, philosophy, explaining the world through the intellect, through rational mind, through logic that is A is either A or something is either A or it's B, it can never be A and B at the same time, like this exclusionary logic, this binary system that I love Ian McGilchrist's work, but I find the left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing is polarizing and difficult in and of itself. And if you actually understand neuroplasticity and brain science, you can see that the brain is entirely capable of switching areas that it's using to a certain degree in its own healing after accidents and so on. But anyway, that's me going into a rabbit hole. But what I'm trying to speak to is this, how important it is whether we see the world through a language that is focused on nouns and on objectifying versus seeing the world in a kind of more verb-based way. And as we're beginning to see the world that way, we're beginning to see ourselves that way. So we become more and more of an object, more and more of something separate from the world that is standing in the world, rather than a node of consciousness that, in the kind of Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana's perspective, is actually bringing forth the world in the way of knowing, that the very act of the world knowing itself through us is the act of the first distinction that then brings forth what the Buddhists call samsara. And we might as well live with it, because you cannot take a perspective without creating a blind spot. But if we are aware of it and we honor the traps of it, and you also, like, because there was a lot in your question or comment, yeah? Of course it's dangerous to vilify Western science or the Western perspective. And there are lots of examples of people in the Western, like, I mean, just read Richard Tarnas's wonderful book, The Passion of the Western Mind, where he actually takes you through how this story evolved in the West. And he also, towards the end, highlights the countercurrent, the Fichte, the Kants, the Hegels, the Goethes, to some extent Rudolf Steiners and so on. The other way of participatory knowing the world. So for me, that's, yeah, I'm agreeing with you that with Plato a lot of things started, but I wouldn't necessarily blame Plato for it. In the sense that I think all these steps are, like, there's a wonderful book talking about the kind of intellectual anthroposophists. Owen Barfield wrote a book called Saving Appearances, Lessons in Ideology, or something like that. It's a small little book. And in it, if I'm remembering the title at the moment correctly, but in it he speaks of original participation, which is the participation of the indigenous, highly, everything is significant. I am part of this web of life, all my relations. The dewdrop that is hit by the sun as I walk past is not a coincidence, not a physical phenomenon that breaks light into a certain visual stimulus. No, it's meaningful. It communicates to me. It says something. That is one way of knowing the world through participation. But I think we needed the story of separation, the Enlightenment, in order to now come to what Owen Barfield calls final participation. And that's going to take us, like, I mean, because we left it so long, I think we're going to get a bit of a pasting that will humble us. But we might just find higher ground rather than go into some kind of end game, which is the other option, which wouldn't be so nice. And I think what we are all about is trying to find different ways of connecting people so we can find that higher ground. And at the moment, we're still using this technology, and may it be with us, but it also comes with a big rat's tail, and it also takes us away from the physical communities each and every one of us are living in every day. And I'm living that in my body a lot at the moment, because it's taking me away from my child, from my relationship, from my neighbors and my community, to be in conversations with people all over the globe, which is magic. But I am realizing it's dangerous as well. And at the moment, I can't do very much more than name it and try to redesign my life in a way that I come back into balance with that. And sorry for a long answer to a not question.
One of the questions that I'm interested in is this issue of a new story, how your aspiration of connecting with underlying natural patterns of health and creating regenerative cultures fit with that trajectory.
I found it really interesting when I started sharing my writing, initially giving away the chapters of my book through Medium, and then it was partially out of realizing, wait a minute, if I post a chapter every week or sub-chapter, then I'm going to be out of chapters soon. And I started posting some of my older writings from my PhD in 2006, Design for Human and Planetary Health. And I realized suddenly that while had I actually bothered to read these chapters, I probably would have felt I would have needed to edit them, and there were spelling mistakes and all sorts of things in there that I would have felt embarrassed about. But then I realized how people were responding to it, and suddenly saw that there were, in this kind of spirit of we'll all keep learning, and what was useful to us on a piece of the journey will be useful to somebody else on their piece of the journey when they pick it up, just in the serendipity of coming across it just when it somehow served them. And the reason why I bring that up is because in that work I developed this notion of salutogenic design. Together with my PhD supervisor. And that's actually, as I now think deeper into how would we develop the current canon of what is regenerative, I see a very strong link between health and what in Regenesis and Kara Sanford language is called participation in nested wholeness. And one of the blocks that my friends in Regenesis, and I've talked to them for 4 years about it so many times that I'm quite happy to talk about it to anybody now. What we don't seem to see eye to eye about, which I find so important in the evolution of this work, is that there are two different ways of understanding health, which was the other bit that is also in this PhD work from back then. The notion of meta design, that before we even go into new ways of being, seeing, and living together, we need the narrative bit. The how do we actually, who are we? What is our relationship to this world? And how do we bring forth a world together? Because otherwise we repeat the same pattern, and we try to introduce something in a context that is very resilient, as you were saying, that where the narrative is still very strong. So for me, this salutogenic understanding of health that Aaron Antonovsky, an Israeli health scientist, developed, actually based on the research to say, how can this generation of my parents and grandparents have lived through the Holocaust and now laugh with their grandchildren and set up functional new enterprises in Israel and be perfectly functional human beings again? Where is that resilience coming from? What kind of health is possible? And he wrote this book called Health, Stress, and Coping, which is in the 1960s, which is the title could be written yesterday or today, and people would pick it up. It seems certainly something that I could pick up again. In that book, he highlights that a sense of belonging and a narrative of meaning was one of the magic ingredients in being able to continue live with that horror. And he then also distinguishes that we've got it wrong in our current understanding of health, where health is understood as some kind of perfect state that we then fall out of to show symptoms of dis-ease, and then we treat those symptoms, and then we go back into health. he said, no, health is something much more complex than that. Health is an ongoing learning of journey. And you could go even further, bringing in complexity theory. Health is an emergent property of a complex dynamic system at all levels of wholeness. It manifests in a cell, in an organ, in an individual, in a family, in a community, in a bioregion, in an ecosystem, and in the planet. And it's all interrelated. It isn't separable, because it's a field phenomenon of the whole and how the whole relates to itself. And in that context, then this notion of salutogenesis, like, because to finish that little thing about my disagreement with the other great like people who really have given depth to the regenerative field for the last 25 years, people like Carol Sanford and Pamela Mang and Ben and all of them. They see health as maintain level work. They see it in the way that culture sees it. You fall out of health and then you go back into it. So it's maintaining something. And so the whole metaphor of we are systems nurturers, we're systems healers, we're working towards healing where the system is blocked and information doesn't flow. They can't fit it into their wonderful frameworks that are extremely deeply developmental. But the minute you make that mental switch and you say health is a dynamic process, health is evolutionary, health is a story of learning, you integrate your experience of whatever ill health you had and you make your best with it. Sometimes it means you're limping for the rest of your life. Otherwise, it means that you actually ultimately in better state in the future to weather a disruption because you've been unhealthy. So yeah, we talked about the seeing, which is the both dynamic and understanding that in this participation in nested wholeness, we don't have a choice. We are affecting everything, every second, with our attention, with what we think, with what we say, with how we act. And our conversation here is not theory, and let's stop being theoretical and start getting practical. This is highly practical. This is restoring and transforming something. We don't know what, and we can't control and predict what it transforms. But conversations have agency. Thoughts have agency in this entire wholeness. And if we take responsibility that we can choose to ignore that for another few centuries, or well, we won't ignore it for another few centuries, but for another few years or maybe decades. But ultimately, it's part of the nature of existence in a relational universe, that what the Buddhists call karma, what's so deeply in the Vedanta, in so many wisdoms traditions, that things come back to you, because you is actually everything you're looking at. The seer and the seer are one. And how do we, from that new way of seeing, find a ground to be differently? Well, I think because we left it so late, we are now confronted with what I would call a species level rite of passage, where we have called cultures that had rite of passage for millennia, for our long regenerative history as a species. We used rites of passage to grow into maturity as members in the community of life at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, something like that. And now we have uninitiated 70-year-old teenagers leading world economies or leading businesses like Tesla. And it's ripping us apart. And now what's happening, because we've pushed the world so far to the edge of abyss through our current actions, and we're not a cancer on the planet, and we're not the evil of all. We have the potential to be the opposite. That's really important to say. But we are undergoing a moment which all rites of passage hold in common, which you have to be uncertain of whether you're going to make it. because only in that moment you get cooked to the level of humility that you can let go. And in that moment, I think if we as human beings get to that level of maturity that we are life and therefore all is fine and the story will continue without us if we're too stupid to learn. But we have potential to be so much more. And we could potentially become healers of the systems we've so greatly impoverished. And whether we're going to make it, I think it's going to be a little bit of both. We're going to see the horror and we're going to see the beauty as we have done for centuries. But my own positivity about it is not as strong as when I wrote my book in 2016. That's for certain.